It's the Digital Babble with your host, Flipper. Colorful commentary on your photography. Seen on fingerlakes1.com.
Hey, everybody. It's me, Flipper, on the Digital Babble. First show, episode 1, here on fingerlakes1.com. It's February 20th at 7 o'clock. Basically, this show is all about pretty much photography. And I'm going to be explaining a lot of different things about photography, and we're going to do some photo edits. And it's going to be a show basically to help you out and to take your photos and do something with them. Make them better, make them different, make them whatever as we go through this journey of learning different techniques, different ideas behind photography. So the first show, of course, is going to be all about the basics, which is the basics of all photography is exposure. Knowing the difference between the different elements of exposure and how they relate to each other is one of the best tools a photographer can have to understand why the camera is taking the photo that it's taking. So starting right off, let me see if I can find the diagram I got here. So exposure is made up of three things. The ISO, which is the sensitivity of the film or the digital sensor. So if your ISO is higher, it means that it can accept light faster. It's more sensitive. So the higher the number, the more sensitive. The lower the number, less sensitive. A lot of times, a lot of photographers will relate ISO to the higher the sensitivity, the more digital noise there is. So it looks grainy, it looks spotty at times. The lower the ISO, the more this smooth transition. So like if you got that wonderful sunset out in the background, you got the sun, and then you got these wonderful shades of orange, yellow, red, that kind of transition right into blue. A lot of times you get that with the lower ISO, and it doesn't look banded or separated in color. So that's really ISO. The other piece of exposure is the shutter speed, which is how long the shutter stays open to expose the film or the digital plane to get the photo that you see when you take the photograph. The other element is also the aperture. The aperture is how wide or how open your lens is. Now, this actually, aperture happens with every lens out there, whether you have an iPhone or not an iPhone, or you have a SLR or even a point and shoot. There's always an aperture, and that's how big the hole is that allows light to come in and actually hit the film plane or the sensor to create the photo that you're trying to take. So these three elements are all tied together into this kind of pyramid thing that I have over that way. So it's really kind of interesting to see how it all relates to each other. So what happens is that a sensor or a light meter will give you the proper exposure as it sees it, which is 18% gray. It thinks that everything it sees in front of the camera is 18% gray. So that's how it calculates your exposure. We'll get into that more into another show, but it's all based on 18% gray. So about a third of the way down on that pyramid is about 18% gray. It's not quite white, it's not quite gray. You know, it's kind of that almost. So, and that's how the cameras actually see the real world. As we see it in high def. It sees it in 18% gray, in shades of gray. So all these things are tied in together. You have several different types of exposures. You have your long exposure, which is where the shutter stays open for seconds instead of a fraction of a second. You've got short exposure or high speed exposure, which would be where it's milliseconds or very high fraction of a second. So like 1/500th of a second. So it's like, bang, got the shot. So, you know, there's several different ways that the camera and yourself can look at the different types of exposures and look at a scene when you're trying to take it. So one of the big things that really dictates how exposure works is that the camera gives you what it thinks is the correct exposure. Then you as the photographer or artist has to then determine whether you like that exposure or not. So that's where digital is coming really as number one. Film, you couldn't really do too much of this, but digital, you can actually take the picture, go look at it, and go, "Oh, I don't like that. I do like that. Oh, maybe it needs to be a little darker, a little lighter." If you know these settings, you're going to be able to take and lighten the picture, darken the picture, just by making a few adjustments. So like saying if our camera says exactly what's on screen here, the shutter is 1/60th of a second, the aperture is f11, and the ISO is 200. If we want to make it darker, the shutter speed has to be faster. So instead of 1/60th of a second, it would be 120th of a second. So 1/120. So that's would then make the exposure a little darker than what the camera thought it should be. Same thing in reverse. If you want it to be a little lighter, you can then adjust one of these settings. So saying if you want it a little lighter, you're going to take the aperture and you're going to roll it back just a touch and go to f8. So that will allow a little bit more light coming through at the same shutter speed, at the same sensitivity, to lighten the photo. So that gives you a quick overview of exposure and how these things relate. There is the reciprocation rule, which is, I know, big word, right? I can't even pronounce it half the time. So the reciprocation rule basically means that everything here, the exposure, so the ISO, the shutter, and the aperture, whatever is the proper exposure, whatever you get for a proper exposure, you can get the same exposure by changing 2 out of the 3 settings to match it. So like saying if you set your shutter speed up to 1/120th of a second and then change your aperture down to f8, you would get the same exposure as what is depicted on screen. It sounds weird, but really there's a reason for it. And that's where we get into this idea of creative exposure. It's basically where you can get into, well, geez, I really want a little bit longer exposure so I can get that really pretty waterfall to really pop, because I want the water to look like it's painted on. I want to get a little bit more of that sunset and get a little bit deeper color, but I need a little bit more depth of field. So I'm going to have a higher aperture, but I got to lower the shutter speed to get the same exposure. So that's really where everything kind of balances in, is that reciprocation law. And that's really a great thing to keep in mind and keep it in your toolbox. So once you get experimenting, you can actually see how it all relates. So, but for this episode, it's really just about exposure, learning about exposure, how it works, how you see it on your camera. A lot of people have point and shoot cameras. They work just the same way. They're going to have on their displays a shutter speed, which will be displayed as 1/1000th, 1/160th, 1/120th, or into the seconds, which look like a new number, so like 5, and then a double quote. That gives you how many seconds you are going to stay open. Aperture is all done based on a mathematical formula, which is the F is really the F basically is your length of your lens. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens, so it's 50 millimeter divided by 11, that's how big the opening actually is. That's how the math works out. How it's going to work out for you is going to be trial and error. I think a lot of people, if you just do a little bit of trial and error, you're going to find that a lot of these things will work itself out in the sense that you're going to get a sense of how each thing works together. So the best thing I can tell you is shoot, and try a little different things. So maybe you see a technique on here on the digital Babble. You can then look at it and say, okay, let's try changing this setting. Let's try changing that setting. And then try a few shots, and then once you get used to it after a while, you'll then really get a feel for how the camera is looking at the real world. Remember I said that exposure is all based on 18% gray. 18% gray is everything in this world. It thinks that if whatever's in front of the lens is going to be 18% gray, you can then think like the camera. So that's where we get, like, if you're a professional photographer, even if you're not, you might take a 18% gray card, stick it out in your scene, meter off that, and then shoot the shot, and you would then be able to tell what your settings are going to be ahead of time, so then you can make your modifications accordingly. Standard exposures are pretty much the cameras. Usually, most of the cameras nowadays figure it out for you. So you pull your trigger halfway on your point and shoot or on your SLR, and it'll give you that wonderful, here's your base exposure. Then you as a photographer then can make decisions on, well, do I want a higher aperture? Do I want a higher shutter speed? Do I want a lower aperture, lower shutter speed? Do I want to change my ISO? Great example of making these changes is if you're looking at a scene that involves a person. Typically, you're going to be fairly close to the person, maybe 6 feet, we'll say. Maybe you're going to have a background that's a little too noisy. So we know that we want to have a low aperture. That way you get as little depth of field as possible. And we'll explain that in another show about depth of field and aperture and so on and so forth. But just take my word for it right now. The smaller the aperture, the less depth of field there is. The higher the aperture, or the bigger the number on the aperture, the more depth of field there is. But again, you need a longer shutter speed with higher aperture, whereas with a smaller aperture, you need less of a shutter speed. I know I'm kind of going in circles with this topic, I guess, so I'm going to try to keep moving forward here. So, when you're out shooting at portrait, you want to kind of make the background soft. As you can see behind me, my background isn't soft. You can see my door. You can see my books. Let me see if I can move this way. You can see my music stuff. You can definitely see behind me without any question. If we change the aperture to be as low as possible and we took the same shot, you wouldn't see all that in great detail. It would be nice and fuzzy. It would be nice and soft. And that's where aperture plays a big role, Shutter speed, on the other hand, really plays a big role in two things. Shutter speed plays a really big role in whether you can handhold a shot or not. And what I mean by hand-holding, you pull up with a camera, pull it halfway, pull the trigger halfway, and then take the shot. If it's too low of a shutter speed, you're going to see what we call camera shake, which is where you can see your body movement. So you're trying to take that picture and you're kind of shaking just a little bit. What it does is it takes the detail and fuzzes it out. So that's one thing that you got to keep in mind when you're taking like point and shoots, is to look at your shutter speed and make sure that it's higher than what you're shooting your picture at. So like saying if your length on your picture, saying the zoom length on your picture is 50 millimeter, you got to be faster than 1/50th of a second. We'll go into that in more detail in the shutter show coming up in a few weeks, I guess. Depending on if you guys like this show or not. I hope you do, because I do. I'm enjoying this so far. It's great. So if you want to send me an email, you want to check us out online, the domain name's not up yet, but it's going to be TDBNY, so thedigitalbabbleny.com, and it'll take you right to our homepage. Or you can send me an email at thedigitalbabble@gmail.com. and make recommendations. Or if you want to submit some photos for me to photo edit and see what I would do with them. If you're a photographer out there, a professional photographer, you want to come in and just kind of talk about different techniques that you might want to share with the audience, please email me. We can get you on. We can get you on through Skype, or you can actually come and sit in the studio with me. So there's my plug for the day. Let's go back to the topic. So exposure, it's all about really what the camera sees and then what you tell the camera to do. And that's why one of the best tips as a photographer I can give you is one, know your camera. You got to know your camera. I can't know your camera for you, but I know that if you go read the manual and if you go out on some of the forums and look, you can find all sorts of information about how to work your camera. Reading the instructions has got to be key, because you never know what the symbols are from one camera to another. Like in Canon, the asterisk symbol basically is to hold the exposure until you recompose. In the Fujitsu world, I don't think they have that symbol. So it's one of those things where reading your manual is really key in making the best sound choices about what you're shooting. So we're at 7:15 right now. I think I've covered exposure pretty well. If you want more on exposure, we can always send me an email. Give me questions. Send in your photos. I'll keep it anonymous. I mean, if you just want your first name and what city you're in, that's fine too. I can keep it totally anonymous and just work on the photos here. So the second part of the show really comes down to looking at some photos, seeing what I think might be a better way to do it, or maybe some changes or whatever. So I'm going to sit back in my chair and I'm going to flip over to some photos here, and we're going to review these photos together. So as soon as it loads. So here up on this first photo is one of my favorite photos that I've taken with my Canon 5D, which is a very, very high-end, well, not the highest end, but definitely a high-end digital SLR. I was testing that out with some new lenses that I had gotten, and this is my favorite cat, one of my favorite cats, Jakey. And as you can see, the exposure is not too bad, but the depth of the exposure is kind of off, and so isn't the color tones. So you can see here, let me draw here. We got a little bit too light right here in his front cheek here, and then the background. As you can see in the background, remember I was talking about ISO, and the higher the ISO, the more noisy it looks. Right here, you can see all the pixels and how it's pixelated. You can also see a great example here of a very low aperture, because you can see Jakey here is right spot on sharp. His eyes are nice and sharp. His nose fairly sharp. You can see the fur right here is really tack sharp. But then when you get back here to the chairs, they're a little bit out of focus, and that's where a low aperture, like I think I shot this at f2.8, so that's a really low aperture, so it fuzzes out the background. It makes the depth of field very shallow. The noise is mostly because I had to use a higher ISO to capture the same shot. And so that's really what we're gonna look at. So let me clear the whiteboard again, and this is what I'm going to do with this first photo to edit it up. We're going to take and we're going to change the color and match him to what color he really is. He is not this kind of washed out orange. He's actually quite orange. So what we'll do is we'll take and do a quick edit and get the color temperature back where it needs to be. Then what we're going to do is we're going to bring up the exposure of the shadows just a touch. And then we're going to bring down the exposure of this front whisker, hopefully. Basically just to balance out the exposure just a little bit. And then probably I'm going to throw a little contrast in here, because, I mean, Jakey really does look best with a little contrast. Most people look best with a little contrast. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to take you into Photoshop. So we're going to pop over to Photoshop so you can see my screen. And I'm going to pop in here, and as you can see, as I move, you're going to see it. So this is the picture of Jakey. We're going to start off, and we're going to do a quick, I think we're going to just do a hue and saturation adjustment, because this hue and saturation adjustment is very powerful. You can shift the colors any direction you want by shifting this hue slider. So we're going to shift it a little bit more towards the red to the left here. We're going to see if we can't. Oh, now he's getting red, so maybe we don't need that much. Maybe we're going to bring back just a little bit right there. And we're going to saturate just a touch more. So as you can see, the colors are now starting to pop off the page here. We got a little bit more orange. We're getting a little more red. And that's really the key here is what do I want to make the picture look like? Or what do you want to make the picture look like? And that's really key here. You're the artist, you're the photographer. You can have fun with this, and you can do this in almost any photo editing program. I just prefer Photoshop because I know the tools. And you can like Photoshop too, and you can get Photoshop Elements right now for I think $79 down to Walmart, and you get pretty much the same tools that I'm working on here, just not any of the advanced tools. I think some of the things that are missing is the layer compositions and some of the channel pieces, but it's really not that big of a deal. If you're just going to edit single layer photos, you can follow along with most of these edits and pretty much get the same results. So I'm gonna show you. We're gonna really oversaturate this and show you how ugly this can get really quick. 68% increase to saturation really looks weird. So let's bring it back down. We can bring it down to where it's negative 60-some%. It looks almost like a black and white photo. which is how you do get a black and white photo. You desaturate it. But let's get it back to where I want it. 35, 20, 35. Let's settle in right around 30. I think 30 is pretty nice compared to the original. He's nice and orange. He's got those rings going around him. He's got his markings. He looks good. Maybe I want to darken it just a touch. So we're going to go on the lightness. We'll go -3 or 4. Maybe probably 4. Notice that I brought it down just a touch here, and we're now that front whisker area here, right here. I'll show you with the paintbrush here, or paint bucket. You know, it's kind of a little bit more gray and it leaves a little bit more detail in there. So now we're going to take and we got that edit done. Let's now take and let's get some exposure stuff working here, since we want to demonstrate how we can change exposure here in Photoshop. So I'm going to pick a levels edit here. We're going to change the levels, which is a really basic exposure adjustment. It basically gives you a dark slider or shadow slider, which is over on the left here. Then you got a highlights exposure over on the right. And then you got the midtone slider in the middle. And what this does is it gives you the ability to control all three aspects: the shadows, the highlights, and the actual midtones. Right now, I'm kind of looking at it going, you know what? The shadows just aren't dark enough. Let's bring the shadows up a little bit. So probably about, oh, that's too far. See how contrasty this got? Because I cut off the histogram, which we can talk about the histogram sometime. But right now, we're going to just kind of bring it back and kind of play with this until we get what I want here. And I'm thinking probably right about 6, 7, 8 looks good. And the highlights, we want to bring the highlights back into check, so it looks right. Notice the front whiskers here are properly exposed, they're proper tone, but the detail is still there. Let me zoom in so you can see it. Before, on the original picture, this was all washed out. Now, just by making those two simple edits, I got the detail back, so it actually looks like he has fur there. Let's zoom back out, and we will look at the whole picture overall. I like the contrast. I like the color. I'm going to just maybe darken it just a touch with the midtones. Just a touch. Not too much. Needless to say, sometimes just a touch in Photoshop is like 0.5%. So maybe what we do is we'll use the keyboard. We'll get in here and push up and down and see where we want to get. And yeah, that's just about a touch. He's kind of nice right there. So there's Jakey with 2 edits on exposure and the coloring. So maybe we want to get kind of interesting a little bit, and we want to just bring up the shadow detail just a touch. We can do a couple of different things. We can do the curves. Curves is a very powerful adjustment layer. And the nice thing about these adjustment layers, you can do all these adjustments and keep doing these adjustments and so on and so forth. And you can have hundreds of these adjustment layers versus making copies of each layer and doing it. It saves on the file size. It really does. I'll demonstrate that sometime in a show, because that's really a key point to Photoshop and using layers. So I want to bring just the shadows just up just a touch. So notice I'm down here in the shadow area, if you can see where my mouse is moving on screen. And we're going to just bring it up, and we're going to bow this just a touch, just to bring out the midtones as well. And then we're going to darken the highlights just a touch, just so we get a little bit of contrast. Maybe too much there. Right about, some place in there. I like that. That looks pretty good. And again, here's a great example of just doing several adjustment layers. I don't want to see one of these. Maybe I want to see what they look like without. I can just go click the eyeball, and the eyeball next to each layer will then redo the adjustment. I'm still thinking one of these edits are just not quite the way I want it. Probably that one. The curves brings it up. The levels is probably the one that I'm not liking. But we'll keep it anyway. The nice thing about this too is you can dial in your adjustment accordingly. So like the curves, saying I don't like that much curve, I can come up to the opacity and I can change it from 100% down to 75. And notice as I change it, I let Photoshop catch up with me. You can see it changes the picture. So you can dial in your adjustments very fine-tunedly, dial in your adjustments accordingly, which makes it really nice. So we're going to leave it at 100%. I'm going to call this one done for now. So what we're going to do is we're going to go File. I'm a little new at this, so please bear with me. I got to remember where everything is. So File, Save As, and we do a JPEG. And it's the after picture. Yep. Okay. Save. Okay. Now that saved it back to my video processor. And now we can go look at the original and the after. So let's go take a look at the original and the after. So right here is the original of Jakey as soon as it comes up. So there's the original of Jakey. Again, lost detail here in the whiskers. Little washed out on the color here and here. The background's a little fuzzy because of a low aperture, but that's fine. There's a bit of digital noise here that I didn't take care of, but that's okay. But we made the background up here a little more contrasty. We made his eyes a little more contrasty. We corrected the color, and then these rings here should be popping out on the new image. So let's go take a look at here's the before. So let's give you the before. Here's the before, and here's the after. And was there much of a change? Enough to say that there was. Now he's more orange. He's got his rings. There's a little more contrast. The background lightened up a little bit, but yet the chairs kept the contrast of the whole scene. So there's edit 1. So every week we're going to be doing, let me pop it back over here to the host, and hi everybody. And every week I'm going to be doing about 3 pictures. So I'm going to try to fit them in between 7 and 7:45, the whole show. We'll do 3 pictures. We'll explain some different things about the pictures. I'll say what I think the picture needs. Maybe it doesn't need anything, but we can always review any picture that you want. If you just send it to me, thedigitalbabble@gmail.com, you can send in pictures, and I'll try to get them on the show every week. If you're a photographer, want to come on the show, talk about these pictures with me, or come on via Skype or on the phone, you can look these pictures over and say, hey, I really think I'd like to see it like this. We can do that. So here we are. Picture 1's down. Jakey's done. Let's try number 2. This is one of my favorite pictures. We were at Sonnenberg Gardens. This was a fun picture to take over the shoulder. Really a neat pose to capture somebody doing something that they love, whether it's a photographer taking a photo, or whether it could be somebody that's doing sports or somebody doing something else. And taking this 3/4 over the shoulder kind of shot sometimes depicts what the person's doing, tells a story. So that's kind of a neat pose. I really like it. But here's the problems with this, and this is one of those photos that I look at. Every time I look at it, I go, there's just something it needs to be changed here or there or wherever. So right here, this young lady's hair here is a little bit too dark, and you lose the details. So we really need to lighten the shadows just a touch. Her skin tone here is definitely blotchy at best, and definitely in the shadow area, so we need to bring that up as well. And here's the thing, we don't want to take the rest of the scene, as you can see out here, the camera exposed for the scenery. So you can see the tree is perfectly exposed. The water fountain here, this is at Sonnenberg Gardens. If you ever get a chance, go to Sonnenberg Gardens out in Canandaigua. It's a wonderful place, especially in the fall or late spring. They have some wonderful displays of plants, and the mansion is interesting to go through and look at, and it's just an amazing place. But as you can see here, all these pieces out in the scene, the background is just perfectly exposed. But, coming back here, the hand here is just not exposed right. The skin tones are a little off. So why don't we take it into Photoshop, and we'll do some edits that way, and we'll fix some exposure things here. So let me clear my whiteboard. We'll go back into Photoshop, and we'll go up here and click on the second picture. So a couple of different ways that we can do the lightening of the hair. We can do a layer adjustment, or we can do an image adjustment. So what I'm going to probably do is I'm going to do an image adjustment, which is destructive. So we don't really want to recommend that as the end-all be-all, but it is a way to get some things recovered if you have a problem with one piece or another piece of a photo. So like one of the tools in the image adjustment area is the shadow and highlights tool, which is off the screen because it opened it the opposite direction. Let me see if I can get it to open the other way. I guess I can't. So shadow and highlights is about 3/4 of the way down on your menu. That's what you're looking for, is shadow and highlights. So here we can see, here's the adjustment, here's what's happened. Notice we brought back some detail in her hair, but it looks kind of funny now. So why don't we bring the shadows back down just to where the hair still has detail, but not that dark, but let's bring it up probably somewhere around 10%. And that'll give us a little bit more depth here so we can work with it. So there we go. I'm going to hit OK, and that's going to apply the actual edit. Now we're going to start working with some of our other exposure options. Like exposure, we can do an exposure correction, which is the adjustment channel and exposure. So saying if we want to bring everything up a lot lighter, we can increase the exposure to 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever it takes to get it there. I'm only going to go about 3/4 of a stop here, approximately. And then we got an offset. Offset is basically what piece of the photo you want this to apply to. So if it's more of a negative offset, it's going to be more contrasty. If it's a positive offset, it's going to be less contrasty. I know that is not a technical term. That is a flipper term. Go ahead and use it if you want. And then gamma correction is really, I don't really use gamma correction, but that's basically a lightness value to allow you to gauge and judge where the exposure should take place. Whether it's higher or lower in the histogram or whatever. So I'm going to bring the offset back down to 0. And I'm just going to play with the exposure piece. And I'm just going to kind of get this kind of looking the way I want it. And I think that's about where I want it. Now the one thing I want to make sure is that this edit, notice out here in the background, everything's just like gone white. It's way too hot. What we can do is mask that out with the layer mask, which is right here where the finger is. What we can do now is we can draw our paint. Whoops. I clicked the wrong area here. We can draw our paint out there with black. So I got black selected as my foreground color. I got a nice big soft brush. I'm going to make it a little bigger. And we can now just paint. And what this does is then takes that adjustment layer and says, yeah, I don't want that there. So notice now I'm bringing the details back in and bringing the exposure back down and balancing it. Like so. And I'm just doing this quick as a paint job instead of doing like layer masks or anything like that. So there we go. I really don't like the skin tone colors. The skin tone colors are really just washed out gray. I really got to do something with it. So I'm going to try just doing a vibrance adjustment here, which was off screen. But the vibrance adjustment layer is where we can get some really nice colors to pop without being oversaturated. So less, more, less, more, less, more. And notice I keep going back and forth because I'm used to seeing this as here's the standard. Now, what does it look like? And then I look away, and sometimes I lose where I wanted to be. And that's one of the problems like a lot of photo editors get into, is they get so used to seeing overly saturated photos that they immediately go to the 80% saturation, and it just looks off. It's just like it's just not natural. Some people like that, some people don't. I'm one that I like a little bit more natural looking photo. I like greens. I like the skin tones to be proper. I also do like the fact that you can adjust these accordingly. I'm going to bring the saturation up just a touch, just to pop those colors off the thing. So notice now her skin's still in the dark here. So why don't we try to get that to look a little better here. We're going to try to do that with a... What do I think would work best? The problem here is that you could do a lot of different edits, use a lot of different tools to get to the same place. So we could color balance it. We could... I'm going to do a hue and saturation. We're going to see if we can't find that color. I bet you it's probably in the red area. Oh yeah, her skin tones are right in the red area. Red and yellows. So we're going to take and shift those just a touch to the yellow way, which would be positive. And we're going to saturate them just a little bit more, bring them up. And then I'm going to get the yellows, and I'm going to saturate them up, make sure I can see them. Oh, yellows are in the background. They're not in the foreground. And you'll learn something about me real quick. And the one thing is I do not see colors normally like most people do. I mean, you might see a fuchsia color, you might see a banana yellow color. I see more of RGB. I'm trying to figure out what the numbers are for when I come into Photoshop. I can actually find that color because there isn't necessarily a color called banana yellow in here that would match real world banana yellow. So that's one thing about me. I like to experiment a lot. I like to play around with the different aspects of it. Play around. I'm going to adjust the magentas now, see if I can find it. Yep, there's some magenta in her skin. So let's bring that over to the yellow area just a touch. Trying to get those skin tones, and we're going to lighten that up a little bit. I'm having a hard time getting those colors to come back to where I want them. There we go. That looks a little better. Red finally popped up there a little bit. Magentas. Cool. So that gave us a little bit better. So let's do one more edit here. I think what we're going to do is we're going to take and we're going to just do a curves, but we're going to take one of the default curves, and what we're going to do is we're going to increase the contrast just a touch. So we're going to do medium contrast. That's about 3/4 of the way down on the menu, as you can see here. And notice it got real contrasty. We lost the detail in the hair up here again. Things are a little too sharp maybe. So what I'm going to do is come back into the layers, and I'm going to change that curves adjustment layer opacity down to probably, I don't know, probably somewhere around 50%. That way the hair comes back, but is a little darker, a little more contrasty. Well, maybe about 25-30%. Well, I'll leave it at 30. 30 looks good. I like that. So let's go save this one, and we'll save this one. Save as. Maybe I can just hit save. Let's see. Nope, it's going to still do the same thing. So we're going to go back and save that back to, yep. Save that back to our video stream. And now what we're going to do is we're going to, as soon as I get done saving here, everything's slowing down here. So now we're going to go back to our original one. So there's the original, looks decent. Lost the detail in the hair here. Skin tone's a little blotchy, a little too dark. But this looks all good. This is all good. I like this. So I'll put a little smiley face here. So that's looking good. So let's look at the new image. So image number 2. Notice we brightened it up. We got rid of a little bit of the blotchy skin over here. You can see that smoothed out a little bit, not so magenta and red and blotchy. The exposure out here got a little brighter, but still stayed nice and saturated. Didn't get kind of wonky with the colors. The blues really popped out through the trees. So that's looking pretty good. So I would probably call this one done. Maybe change a few things. You never know. Just you take a look at a picture one time. It's very possible to look at a picture one time and go, hey, that's great. And then next time be like, yeah, maybe I should have done this or that or the other. Which is kind of where I think this next picture is going to go. So let's do this next picture real quick because we got 5, 6, 7 more minutes. So I'm going to do number 3 here. This was a wonderful shot at a wedding I shot, and I just can't get over these rings. These rings just popped off the page. But we lost a lot of this feel for the blotchiness of the skin here. The knuckles are definitely really red, where the skin tone's more of a yellow here. Her skin's right spot on, except for a few things. But what we lost was the color depth of the flowers here. The color depth is really kind of washed out. And mostly that's because I took too high of an exposure. My exposure was higher than what the camera thought the exposure was supposed to be higher because of the diamonds and the reflectiveness of the rings. Reflecting more light back into the camera, so it was kind of like, oh, okay, maybe it was picking up more of the background, and it made it way too light. So we can fix that. We can play around with this just a touch here. We got 5 minutes. I think I can do it. Flipper's 5-minute photo fix here. So let's pop over to Photoshop here real quick. We'll pull that baby up. Okay, so here we are. So let's do a couple quick edits here. We're gonna get some hue and saturation adjustments. We're gonna take the reds and we're going to move the reds a little bit to the yellow to try to get that blotchy knuckle syndrome out of there. And we're going to take the yellows and move them more towards the reds. Like so. Maybe I got magentas in here again. You know, that's the funny thing. Looking at this on screen, sometimes you can't tell what the real color is because of the way your monitor is displaying the color. So sometimes you got to experiment, and it happens. All right, so the magenta is actually where the flowers are residing. As you can see, as I put these up, notice it's all magenta. So what we can do is to bring some of the color back of those flowers, we can really pump up the volume with the saturation here, probably almost too much. Maybe we'll bring a lightness up, maybe wash them out a little bit. Nah, let's go the other way. Let's go dark. Yeah, maybe we're gonna leave them at 0. Huh. That's kind of funny. I figured something would have popped them up a little bit, but okay, great. So we see here the knuckles are a little less red. The yellow and the reds have kind of mixed in together. Her hand now is really smooth, except for the blue line for vein here. The rings are looking pretty good. I like that. Let's pop back down the layers. We're going to do another adjustment. We're going to do a curves adjustment. I want to get some mid-tone contrast in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an increased contrast. Notice how it's just like harsh. It's like whack and it hits you. So what we want to do is we want to take and tone that down with the opacity here. So we're going to just pop that back and be like, okay, there's none, there's full. Let's bring it right around 40-ish, I think. I think 40 is going to be good. Now, saying if we want to check and see what it looks like with and without, you got the little eyeball here. We can go boom, 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 boom. Oh yeah, I like it with the contrast here. That looks really good. Again, without, with. So I think it's really looking good here. It's really coming together nice and sharp here. So let's maybe do like levels and see what they look like. Okay, so the histogram is definitely nice, but it's I don't know. I almost want to make it brighter. It almost looks like it should be a high key photo. So let's bring the skin tones back down just a touch. Let's bring up the highlights. Yeah, I like that. That's starting to look sharp. Now, granted, one of the bad side effects to adding contrast and stuff, notice the knuckles now have come back into play where we might have to adjust the hue and saturation again. So why don't we do that real quick? We'll have another layer, hue and saturation. Let's go to the reds layer, see if we can find those knuckles. Yeah, they're all right there. So why don't we pop it more towards the yellow, which would be a positive. And maybe desaturate them just, well, maybe we're going to oversaturate them just a touch. Yeah, that looks good. Right there. So now it looks more like the skin tone is more even. So there we go. I think we got it. I think we got it. I think that's pretty nice. So let's take and we say file save as, and we'll go put this back and we'll show you the before and after. So yes, that's after. Sound effects, pew pew, and here's the save. And now let's go look at it real quick, and we're gonna go, here's the original. So right here's the original. Remember, we had the blotchy skin and the knuckle, and the flowers are washed out, and her skin's just a little off on color, you know, I think, but you know, that's okay. But here's another great example of exposure and having a low aperture. Notice the depth of field. The depth of field falls off from her knuckle, and right about here at the tip of her index finger, it starts to, or her pinky finger. Sorry, I got that wrong. Pinky finger. It starts to fall off and gets all blurry after that, and that's really the key to a small aperture. So let's pop over to the photo edited one. Skin tones are more yellowish. The blotchiness here is kind of faded quite a bit. But the skin tones are nice. The flowers are now popping off the page a little bit. So both areas of the flowers are nice. We got some nice contrast in the ring area here. As you can see, the rings are nice and sharp, and the area between the hands are nice and sharp. Has a lot of tonal value in there. So there you have it. So the before, kind of reddish looking too, and the after. More balanced, a little more skin tone. Everything pops nice, a little more contrast, so on and so forth. So that's been this show of the Digital Babble. Let me get back onto the host. So that's our first episode. So if you got suggestions, give us an email, thedigitalbabble@gmail.com. If you have photos you want to share that we want to photo edit up, what do you think we might do? How do you fix this? So on and so forth. That'd be great. Other than that, next week's show, I believe, is going to be probably shutter speed, and I'm going to have some photos geared around that. I have somebody who did, I think it was Aaron from Seneca Falls, submitted a couple photos that are perfect example of long shutter exposure, long shutter speed. So she'll be coming up on, her photos will be coming up on next week's show, and we'll talk about those, maybe do a few corrections with it. And we'll keep going from here. So that's episode 1 on February 20th with the Digital Babble with me, Flipper. I hope you tune in every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. I'm out of here. Have a great week.
A Flipside Studio production. It's the Digital Babble. Tune in every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on fingerlakes1.com. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter.